You arrive at the edge of history, not with a bang, but with silence. April 1945. You start standing at the gates of Bergen, Belsen, and the smell hits first. It doesn't waft. It assaults, a thick, rolling wave of rot, infection, and decay. It clings to your uniform. It saturates your lungs, and as your boots crunch over dead twigs and human bone, you understand this is no battlefield. This is a graveyard without headstones. There are bodies piled like logs, skeletal, motionless, some with eyes still open. There's no order here, only chaos, no clean distinction between the living and the dead, just thousands of corpses, some too weak to lift their heads, others too far gone to recognize they've been liberated. This is what the Nazis left behind. And it sets what you stare expected to manage. Within 24 hours, your unit begins triage, field hospitals, makeshift barracks, mobile clinics. But medicine alone won't fix this. These people aren't just starving. They're infected, riddled with typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. Their immune systems are hollowed out. Food becomes danger. Clean water, a double-edged sword. Every sip could kill. And amidst it all, the SS, the guards, the tormentors, still here, still alive, still watching. And among them, the women. They don't look like monsters. They look like school teachers, secretaries, nurses. That sets what sets so unsettling. You expect monsters to be twisted, hunched, foaming at the mouth. You don't expect them to wear lipstick or smile in photographs. You don't expect them to be 22-year-old women with soft voices and manicured nails. Irma Grace is one of them. She walks like she still owns the place, blonde, composed, dressed in a perfectly fitted uniform. Prisoners call her the hyena of Auschwitz. She's accused of beating women with riding crops, setting dogs on children, participating in selections for the gas chambers. But she won't admit to any of it. She claims she was just a clerk, a secretary, nothing more. But the testimonies say otherwise. Greece wasn't just part of the system. She was the system. The arrests come fast. Over 80 SS men and women are taken into custody. Some weep, some beg, some laugh in disbelief. You separate them from the prisoners. You interrogate. You document. You prepare the files. Then comes the trial. Lüneburg, 45 defendants, 30 men, 15 women, charged with war crimes and crimes against humanity. You attend the proceedings, not as a soldier, but as a witness, a representative of what liberation is supposed to mean, justice in uniform. The courtroom is cold, efficient. British prosecutors, British judges, rows of observers, and survivors, those who can still walk, testify one by one. Their voices don't tremble. They crack like whips. A woman describes how Irma Grace whipped her for coughing during roll call. Another tells of how Elizabeth Volkenrath stood at the gas chamber door and smiled as it closed. A man speaks of Joseph Kramer, commandant of Bergen Belsen, ordering prisoners to carry corpses barehanded, then beating them when they vomited from the stench. Each account cuts deeper. Each day makes justice more inevitable. And yet, when the sentences are handed down, it doesn't feel like victory. It feels like anatomy, as if you've dissected evil and are now staring at its innards, cold, pulsing, human. 11 are sentenced to death. Kramer, Grace, Volkenrath, Bormann. Their names etched in the court's final judgment. Others receive prison terms. Some are acquitted. But no one walks away unchanged. December 13, 1945. Hameln Prison. The night is quiet, no witnesses, no public audience, no spectacle. This is British justice. Efficient, private, final. Albert Pierrepoint arrives before dawn. He's Britain's chief executioner. A man of method, not vengeance. His father hanged men. So did his uncle. This is a family craft. But Pierrepoint doesn't see it as punishment. He sees it as duty, ritual, precision. Each hanging takes exactly 12 seconds. No more, no less. The condemned are brought in one by one. Kramer goes down without a fight. Gracie, she sings. A German hymn. Then silence. Then the drop. There are no headstones, no markers, no flowers. Their bodies are buried in unmarked graves. Because no one is allowed to mourn them. Because Bergen-Belsen is not about them. But this is not the end. Because what happened here didn't set end in 1945. The diseases, the stench, the horror. It clung to those who survived. It followed them. For decades, survivors would wake up screaming from dreams of Irma Grace's boots, of Kramer's voice, of the piles of bodies in the sun. And those scars didn't disappear with liberation. They multiplied. In silence. In shadows. In post-war Europe where no one wanted to hear them speak. For years, the female guards of Bergen-Belsen were footnotes in history books. Because it's easier to believe that only men commit atrocities. That cruelty wears a square jaw and a deep voice. But the women of Belsen proved otherwise. They didn't just obey orders. They improvised them. They weaponized femininity. They turned authority into performance. They laughed while doing it. And they did it in front of witnesses. You remember one testimony in particular. A girl just 16 when the camp was liberated said she saw Gress strike a prisoner across the face for eating potato peels from the garbage. The prisoner's jaw broke. She couldn't eat after that. She died 3 days later. Of hunger. In a camp surrounded by food, hoarded for the guards. Bergen-Belsen wasn't accident. It wasn't a logistical failure. It was a crucible of cruelty designed, staffed, and sustained by people who made choices. The choice to turn away. The choice to obey. The choice to beat. The choice to enjoy it. And justice, while slow, did come. But it didn't erase the suffering. It didn't bring back the dead. It didn't silence the whispers of those who watched their mothers, fathers, children die behind barbed wire. You stand now at the edge of that field. Bergen-Belsen is gone. Burned. Leveled. Cleansed with fire. But the soil still remembers. The grass grows differently here. The air carries weight. You can feel it in your chest. And when the wind blows through the trees, it sounds almost like singing. But it's not joy. It's warning. A reminder that when cruelty is ignored, it spreads. When obedience replaces conscience, it thrives. And when silence follows atrocity, it repeats. You walk among the ghosts now. The physical camp is gone, its wooden barracks reduced to ash, its watchtowers leveled, its fences torn down. But Bergen-Belsen still breathes. You can feel it beneath your boots, in the churned dirt, in the hollow silence where cries once echoed for miles. Because some places don't vanish when they're destroyed. Some places become wounds. And this one never really closed. After the hangings at Hameln, the world moved on. Headlines shifted. New wars began. The Nuremberg trials took global attention. Hiroshima burned itself into the collective consciousness. But Bergen-Belsen, it faded, not from memory, but from convenience. There were no dramatic gas chambers here, no industrial extermination infrastructure to show the world. The killing here was slower, Dirtier, less efficient, more human. The kind of killing that stains your hands instead of your conscience. The kind of evil that doesn't hide behind machines. It uses hunger, and cold, and disease, and absence. No bullets required, just starvation and silence. That was Bergen Belsen. What makes the female guard so hard to process, so deeply disturbing even now, isn't just the cruelty. It sets the intimacy of it. This wasn't detached evil. It wasn't clipboard cruelty. This was up close, personal, daily. Irma Grace didn't kill from a distance. She stood close enough to spit on you. She beat prisoners herself. She chose who lived and who died. She tortured not with efficiency but with flair, like it was performance. Elizabeth Volkenrath was a block leader. She carried herself like a bureaucrat, organized, obedient, measured, but behind her calm demeanor was cold calculation. She controlled the work details, the food lines, the medical roles, and with those duties came enormous power. At Belsen, food was fate, and Volkenrath decided who got fed, which meant she decided who lived, or didn't. You didn't need a gun to be deadly. All you needed was access. By the time the British arrived, the camp was eating itself. Corpses lay half decomposed in front of kitchens. Maggots spilled into water pails. Sick prisoners shared bunks with the dead. Doctors later called it a living mortuary. It was beyond war, beyond cruelty. It was entropy with a uniform. And when the guards were finally captured, they didn't fight back. They claimed ignorance, orders, confusion. Grease said she was only a junior assistant. Volkenrath said she never hurt anyone personally. They all denied responsibility. They all claimed surprise at the scale of the suffering, despite having walked past the bodies, stepped over the moaning, laughed as people starved. The survivors, they remembered everything. One woman told the tribunal she saw Volkenrath slap a pregnant prisoner so hard she miscarried on the spot. Another described Grease casually assigning women to special detail with a wink code for death. There were no blurred lines. There was no moral ambiguity, just uniforms and choices. The British court was deliberate, controlled. It gave the accused lawyers translations, time to speak. But for the victims, justice could never be enough. Because you can sit balance scales with corpses, you can return what was stolen. You can only name it and bury it and try to make sure it never happens again. That's why the executions, when they came, were so quiet. No firing squads, no gallows crowds, just a prison corridor, a wooden trapdoor, a rope, and a man named Pierre Point doing his job. Grace was the youngest woman ever executed under British authority. She was 22. Pierre Point later said she walked to the gallows calmly, as though she were going to a party. She wore perfume. Her last words were Schnell, get it over with. Volkenrath followed, silent, unrepentant. Each death took less than a minute, and then they were buried, anonymously, deep underground. No stones, no visitors, no myths, but the question lingered, then and now. Is execution justice or vengeance? And when the executioner leaves the room, what is the world left with? An empty cell or an open wound? What happened at Bergen-Belsen didn't die with the guards. It metastasized through memory. Because justice isn't set a moment, it sets a process. And no trial, no gallows, no grave can erase the fact that normal people did this. That women with childhoods, school books, and lovers orchestrated agony. That they watched children starve while brushing their hair. that they could pet a dog in the morning and beat a prisoner in the afternoon. No remorse, no reflection, just uniformity, just obedience. After the war, Germany struggled with memory. The narrative was convenient that the SS were monsters, that the Nazis were others, that ordinary people didn't know, couldn't know. But Bergen-Belsen ruined that lie, because too many ordinary people ran that camp. Too many female guards came from small towns, middle-class families, average lives, and they didn't just follow orders. They made decisions. Greasy chose to whip. Valkenrath chose to withhold food. Bormann chose to ignore screams. These weren't set machines. They were women, with names, with choices, with blood on their hands. You return to the site years later. Bergen-Belsen is quiet now, a memorial, not a prison. Grass grows where the barracks stood. Plaques mark mass graves. Stones list names, some unknown. The air is still heavy. Visitors walk slowly. Whispers dominate. You find the place where the crematorium once stood. It sits just a stone slab now. But if you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. Not the screams, but the silence after. The kind that weighs more than noise. The female guards of Bergen-Belsen were not an anomaly. They were a warning about how easy it is to become a participant in horror, about how thin the line is between apathy and atrocity, about how cruelty needs no uniform to thrive, just permission. And that's what makes their story hard to stomach. Not because they were the worst, but because they were so terribly ordinary. There's one survivor decades later who said it best. She was asked during an interview if she believed justice was served. She paused, then replied, "No rope can match a graveyard." And she looked down, at her arm, at the number inked into her skin, and she said, "They took my family, my childhood, my future. A hanging is not justice. A trial is not justice." She looked back at the camera, and she whispered, "Justice is remembering." The wind cuts through the memorial stones, now cold, sharp, indifferent, just like it did in April 1945, when the British marched into hell and didn't realize it until they stepped in it. They had seen war. They had seen death. But not like this. Not stacked like firewood. Not hollow-eyed skeletons moving on instinct. Barely alive, barely human. Because Bergen-Belsen had been engineered to break something deeper than the body. It had been designed to starve the soul. The guards who ran it, they didn't shout. They didn't need to. The system did their work for them. Disease was the warden. Hunger was the whip. And cruelty, the daily cruelty, wasn't extraordinary. It was routine. That sets what the soldiers couldn't comprehend. The absence of panic. The normalization of death. Corpses, unburied, decaying for days in front of the kitchen. Children, dead in piles, their heads covered by blankets stitched from human skin. Guards laughing, smoking, walking past like it was a public park. The female guards. Some of them had dogs, big ones, trained ones. And they didn't need to give a command, just a nod. The dogs did the rest. There are testimonies that describe prisoners being torn apart for approaching the food line too early. Others who were beaten to death with shovel handles for collapsing in formation. This wasn't sit discipline. This was annihilation by attrition. And the guards, the women, were proud. Irma Gress kept her uniform clean, polished her boots. She was only 22 when she was hanged, but in Bergen-Belsen she carried herself like a queen of death. She was known for walking the perimeter with her riding crop, calling out roll numbers, pointing, always pointing. And when she did, it meant pain. It meant labor. It meant transport. And when you went on transport, you didn't come back. The problem wasn't that these women were monstrous. The problem was that they weren't stut. Not in the way we like to imagine monsters. They weren't foaming at the mouth. They weren't hiding in basements. They weren't twisted by madness. They were ordinary, raised in farms, schooled in towns, trained by the Reich. They were nurses, secretaries, clerks, until one day someone handed them a uniform and a list and said, "These are the enemies of the state." And they believed it. And that belief, more than any order, did the killing. At the Belsen trial, the British prosecutors laid out the evidence meticulously, not just what the guards did, but how, who they punished, who they selected, who they struck. The survivors were not vague. They remembered faces. And when the guards were told to stand, Grease, Volkenrath, Bormann, they didn't look ashamed. They looked bored, as if justice was an inconvenience. Greasy, in particular, smirked often. One survivor said she still smiled the same way she did when she pointed at my sister and told her to walk to the end of the line. The end of the line meant the crematorium. The execution day at Hameln was overcast. Pierre Point arrived with his assistant. Quiet, methodical. He didn't make speeches. He didn't offer judgment. He just read names. He was the final page in a long, bloody book. Each hanging took less than 90 seconds. But the memory lasted lifetimes. The condemned were not given markers. They were not allowed last statements to the world. The British made certain of that. No martyrdom. No myths. Just a rope and a record. And yet, there's something you realize walking through the fields of Bergen-Belsen. Something the rope couldn't fix. The dirt still holds what the gallows could not cleanse. Because evil doesn't vanish when its architects are buried. It lingers. In memory. In denial. In silence. After the war, many of the lesser guards, the nameless, faceless functionaries, disappeared into German society. They changed names, shaved their heads, moved west, and most were never caught. By 1955, many who had received prison sentences were released. By the 1960s, even public discussions of female perpetration during the Holocaust were rare. In West Germany, the narrative of the Trümmerfrau, the woman who helped rebuild Germany from the ruins, overshadowed the reality that many of those same women once held the whip. To suggest otherwise was to reopen the wound. And nobody wanted that. It took decades for the truth to reemerge, through trial transcripts, through survivor testimonies, through footage the British had kept locked away for fear of traumatizing the public. But when it came out, when the photos were finally published, when the documents were released, when the interviews were aired, the world was forced to reckon with a bitter truth. That women are not inherently gentle. That cruelty knows no gender. That sadism wears heels just as easily as boots. And that in the theater of genocide, there are no minor roles, only accomplices. Today, the memorial at Bergen-Belsen includes a section dedicated to the trial. It displays the faces of the accused. It names the judges. It plays the audio from the proceedings. And when you hear the testimony, when you hear survivors describe how Grace ordered her dog to attack a boy who was trying to eat potato peelings from the ground, when you hear a nurse talk about the bodies stacked in the infirmary so high the living had to sleep on them, when you hear a child survivor, now elderly, describe crawling out from beneath corpses to find food, you understand. You understand why justice could never be complete. Because some things cannot be avenged, only remembered. And that's what makes the executions hard to stomach. Not because they were too harsh, but because they weren't sit enough. Not because they were cruel, but because they were clean, Because nothing, not a rope, not a grave, not a verdict, can undo what was done to the people in that camp. They were dehumanized, beaten, burned, forgotten. Until now. Until you remember. Until we speak of them again. That is why this story matters. Because justice doesn't just end in a courtroom. It lives in the telling. It lives in the remembering. It lives in the discomfort. So when you read their names, Irma Grace, Elizabeth Volkenrath, Johanna Bormann, do not flinch from the truth. Do not look away because they were women. Do not soften the edges. They were not victims of a system. They were the system. They enforced it. They embodied it. And in the end they were buried by it. But their victims are not buried. They are remembered. Because the rope could not give them back their lives. But memory can give them back their names. There's a question that lingers at the edge of all of this. A question nobody dares ask too loudly. What makes someone like Irma Grace? She wasn't born into evil. She wasn't starving. She wasn't sprit. She was 17 when she applied to be an SS auxiliary, a farm girl, with blonde hair, clear skin, and quiet ambition, not unlike thousands of others. But somewhere along the way she stopped seeing people as people. She started seeing categories: Jew, gypsy, enemy. And once you do that, once you start sorting the world by labels, you've already begun to kill, because before you put a person in a camp, you have to put them in a box, not just physically but morally. You have to believe that their suffering is earned, that their lives don't matter. Only then can you walk past them as they die. Only then can you strike them for begging. Only then can you laugh when they collapse from hunger. And only then can you go home at night and still sleep. That sets the horror of Bergen Belsen. Not just the death, not just the disease, but the fact that people adapted to it. Even as the prisoners turned to living skeletons, the guards still held dances in their quarters. They still celebrated birthdays. They still ordered new uniforms, as if the smell of rotten, burning flesh outside was background noise, as if it was someone else's problem, and that steps where cruelty becomes something worse. It becomes ordinary. The British prosecutors understood this. They weren't set just trying to hang guards. They were trying to hang a system, to prove that what happened in Bergen-Belsen was not a freak occurrence, but the logical outcome of ideology mixed with obedience. And so in the courtroom, they focused on the everyday, not just the gas chamber, but the food line, not just the execution yard, but the infirmary. One witness testified that her mother had typhus and was left lying naked in the mud for 4 days because the guards didn't want to waste linens. Another recounted being forced to watch her younger sister be kicked to death for not standing fast enough during roll call. And what made these stories unbearable wasn't just their violence. It was the context, the banality, the boredom of it all. One of the female guards admitted during testimony that she didn't feel anything while issuing punishments. It was just part of the job. So what then do we do with that? What do you do with the knowledge that evil can be so unemotional, so mechanical, so polite? The truth is, that's what makes justice hard to stomach. Because we want evil to be dramatic. We want it to be wild-eyed, monstrous, and foaming. But the women of Bergen-Belsen weren't wild. They were measured, organized. They kept charts. They signed rosters. They filed reports. They followed orders, but not always. Sometimes they made decisions of their own. Sometimes they went further than expected. They weren't just obeying. They were participating, willingly. That's why the executions mattered. Not because they solved anything, not because they repaired what had been broken, but because they drew a line, a final line, one that said, "You don't get to do this and walk away." Even if justice came with a rope instead of reconciliation, it was something. It was a warning. It was a message to history. But even that wasn't so simple, because the British didn't gloat over the hangings. They didn't make them public. They didn't sell tickets or film it for propaganda. They buried the bodies in unmarked graves. No names, no plaques, just the sound of dirt over wood. Because even then, even after everything, they knew this wasn't about vengeance. It was about closure. And closure doesn't shout. It whispers. In the years that followed, the Belsen trial faded from popular memory. It was overshadowed by Nuremberg, by the Cold War, by the need to rebuild Europe and move on. But for the survivors, for the families of the dead, the memory didn't fade. It sharpened. It hardened. Because while the world looked forward, they were still haunted by the past. They remembered the guards' faces. They remembered the dogs. They remembered the silence, the way it settled over the camp each night, broken only by coughing, sobbing, or the occasional scream. And for them, no verdict, no sentence, no gallows could erase that. So today, when we stand at the memorial site, when we look at the mass graves, when we read the trial transcripts, we're not just observing history. We're being invited to understand it, to ask ourselves hard questions about obedience, about power, about complicity. Because the truth is, Bergen-Belsen wasn't built by monsters. It was built by people, people who had jobs, people who were promoted, people who had tea breaks, and it was run by women, women who had been told they were serving their country, women who believed in order, in discipline, in ideology, until those beliefs became bullets. And that's why this story can't be left in the past, because the mechanics of Bergen-Belsen still exist. The structure of genocide, the way cruelty is compartmentalized, the way suffering is rationalized, the way violence becomes policy. Those are not Nazi inventions. They are human vulnerabilities, and they live in every age. So when we talk about Irma Gress or Elizabeth Volkenrath or the others who were hanged in that gray prison by British hands, we're not just talking about history. We start talking about warning signs. Because someone like Irma doesn't emerge from a vacuum. She sits groomed, encouraged, protected, until she believes that what she's doing is right, until she smiles when a child dies, until she thinks herself above consequences. But in the end, she wasn't stet. In the end, the uniform couldn't save her. The orders didn't excuse her. The system that raised her up dropped her through a trap door, and history wrote her down, not as a symbol, but as a lesson that cruelty, no matter how normalized, no matter how professional, no matter how quietly executed, will in time be judged. And that judgment may not be loud. It may not be public, but it will be permanent, because the memory of Bergen-Belsen lives on, in the soil, in the photos, in the testimonies, and in us. The rope was only the beginning. The remembering is forever. You walk the gravel path at Bergen-Belsen, but you don't see fences anymore. There are no barracks, no towers, no chimneys, just grass. Grass that grows quietly over mass graves, marked with stones that read, in 6 languages, "Here lie 5,000 dead," and a few meters further, "Here lie 800, here lie 2,000. The numbers blur into silence. There are no names, because the Nazis didn't keep them. And if they did, they burned the lists. And if they didn't burn them, they falsified them. And even if they had told the truth, most of the world wasn't ready to listen. You try to imagine what this place looked like in April 1945. You can't, because what was here is gone. Burned to ash. Not to cover up crimes, but to stop the spread of disease. That's how bad it was. The British didn't dismantle Bergen-Belsen out of pity. They torched it out of necessity. Because the camp had become a biological death machine, rotted with typhus, lice, tuberculosis, gangrene. People were dying after liberation faster than before it. That sips the legacy these guards left behind. Not just bones, not just pain, but a pathogen of cruelty so potent it continued killing long after the shooting stopped. And yet, justice came, quietly, mechanically. As it always does. You stare back in the courtroom now. Lüneburg, 1945. The air still tastes of war. The walls are bare. There's no grandeur here. No marble columns, no high ceiling. Just benches. Ink pens, uniforms, evidence stacked in boxes. On trial, 45 individuals, men, women, SS admin, medics, guards, clerks, people who filed paperwork by day and kicked prisoners to death by night. Some sit stiff-backed, others smirk, a few are crying, but most look bored, as if this trial is an inconvenience, as if their war ended months ago and they're just waiting for someone to come to their senses. But that didn't happen, because this was the British zone. And unlike the Soviets, who were already preparing public spectacles, and unlike the Americans, who were planning the formal Nuremberg trials, the British had a different plan. Keep it small, keep it focused, make it efficient. They didn't want to try every Nazi in Germany. That was impossible. So they focused on this camp, these people, these crimes. Bergen-Belsen. 1945. That was the boundary of the courtroom, and inside those lines they told everything. The corpses stacked like firewood. The children shot for stealing turnips. The women forced to drag bodies with ropes around their necks. The guards who beat inmates with whips, made of barbed wire. The dogs trained to attack on command, tear out flesh, maim, kill. All of it came out, all of it documented, all of it spoken. Sometimes in broken voices, sometimes with sobs, but always with truth, because survivors were watching. And this time, the killers didn't get to control the narrative. One of the survivors who testified had lost her entire family, parents, siblings, cousins, all gone. Some to Auschwitz, some to Belsen. None survived. She stood in front of the court, frail, gaunt, but her voice didn't shake. She pointed at the female guard who had dragged her by the hair through a puddle of vomit for collapsing during roll call. She laughed, the survivor said. Another witness recalled Irma Gress ordering her dog to attack a pregnant woman because she was too slow to stand. Another described Joseph Kramer personally selecting prisoners for execution because they looked too weak to be of use. Another remembered being forced to watch a hanging that lasted 6 minutes, the man kicking and twisting while the guards cheered. This was Bergen-Belsen. This was what justice had to answer for. The defense was predictable. They all said the same thing. I was following orders. I had no choice. I didn't stut, no. But the prosecution came prepared. They showed rosters. They showed signed reports. They played footage. Footage the British cameraman had filmed upon entering the camp, unfiltered, unedited, raw. You can see it today in the archives. Rows of bodies, skin stretched over bone, children sitting beside corpses, eyes so hollow they barely register the camera, and behind it all the guards, still in uniform, still holding rifles, still pretending none of it was their fault. The verdicts came swiftly. 11 death sentences, a handful of life imprisonments, several shorter terms, some acquittals. The press didn't make a spectacle of it. There were no headlines shouting vengeance. The world was already overwhelmed with Nuremberg, with the bombings, with Reconstruction, with famine. But for the survivors and for history, it mattered. Because for the first time in British legal history, female guards were sentenced to death for crimes against humanity. They were hanged in December 1945, not in a public square, not in the open, but in a prison yard, in the cold, one by one, 6 women, 5 men, silently, efficiently, by the hand of Albert Pierrepoint. Pierrepoint didn't relish the job. He never did. But he knew its weight. He would later write that Irma Grace walked to the gallows with her head high. No tears, no pleas, no final words. She was 22 years old. And in that moment when the trapdoor opened, justice met cruelty in a single heartbeat. And history recorded it. But execution was not the end. Because how do you end something like this? You don't stat. You live with it. You remember it. You walk the grass at Belsen. You read the names of the dead. You teach their stories. And you say again and again, never again. Because that's the only victory left to the victims. Not revenge, not redemption, but remembrance. Remembrance that becomes resistance. Remembrance that becomes law. Remembrance that becomes a barrier between what we are and what we must never become. But memory alone is not justice, not by itself. Because justice, true justice, is not a single verdict or a rope pulled taut behind prison walls. It's not a courtroom transcript. It's not even a trial. It sets what happens next, what you do with the knowledge, what you carry forward. And that's where the story of Bergen-Belsen grows more complex. Because after the executions, after the sentences were served, after the camp was reduced to scorched earth and medical quarantine zones, a strange silence crept in. A silence not born from peace, but from exhaustion, from discomfort, from willful forgetting. Germany didn't want to remember. Britain didn't want to dwell. And the world, newly locked into the scaffolding of the Cold War, had bigger enemies to face. The survivors were scattered. The perpetrators, those who weren't tried, faded into ordinary life. Some fled. Some changed their names. Some became bakers, factory workers, husbands, wives, and some simply pretended it had never happened. But survivors don't forget. They can stat. Because Bergen-Belsen wasn't just a location. It was a scar etched into their minds, their skin, their speech, their silence. Many never returned to Germany. Many never spoke of it again. But some did. And they carried the memory like a torch through decades of denial. Into classrooms. Into documentaries. Into courtrooms long after the last gallows creaked shut, because something dark lingered even after the ashes cooled. The questions, not about guilt, that was established. Not about numbers, they were counted. But about how ordinary people, men and women, some young enough to be students, others old enough to be grandparents, could become engineers of daily horror, could laugh while prisoners starved, could strip children of food, clothes, dignity, and still sleep soundly at night. The answers don't lie in ideology alone. They lie in the cracks of human psychology, in obedience, in apathy, in careerism, in the quiet, deadly lie that someone else will stop it. That's what you confront at Bergen-Belsen. That's what the trials illuminated, not just individual cruelty, but the fragility of conscience when power and ideology are given permission to feed each other. Take Irma Gressa, for example. Not just a guard, not just a sadist, but someone who rose through the ranks quickly, who volunteered for camp duty at Auschwitz and later transferred to Bergen-Belsen as a senior warden at age 21. Blonde, charismatic, according to some witnesses, chillingly polite. But it wasn't set politeness that got her convicted. It was her whip. It was the way she conducted selections for the gas chambers. It was the way she beat women until their skin split, or they collapsed. And the way she watched with a half-smile as her dog attacked prisoners too weak to run. She wasn't some pawn. She was the architect of cruelty within her corridor of power. And when she was hanged in December 1945, her final words reportedly were, "Schnell," quick, no remorse, no apologies, only the ritual of justice swallowing her name. But there were others, lesser known, less infamous. Women like Elisabeth Volkenrath, married to another SS officer. She supervised roll calls that sometimes lasted 12 hours, in rain, in ice, in blistering heat. Women fainted, died. She didn't care. And then there was Johanna Bormann, nicknamed the Woman with the Dogs. Prisoners remembered her for ordering attacks, for laughing during beatings, for helping force young girls to kneel in sewage ditches as punishment for stealing food. Each of these women was tried. Each was found guilty. Each was executed, not because of vengeance, but because of the message. Because after the gas had dissipated, after the bullet casings were swept away, the world needed a line, a visible judicial line drawn in blood and law. And that line said, "No uniform absolves you. No chain of command excuses you. No gender shields you." That was the message at Lüneburg. That was the legacy at Hameln Prison, when the noose dropped 11 times. And yet history rarely behaves. As decades passed, some of those sentenced to life were released early. Others who had committed crimes equal to the condemned had fled justice entirely. There were too many. The bureaucracy couldn't keep up. And in West Germany by the 1950s, public appetite for Nazi trials began to wane. People wanted to rebuild, to forget, to start over. Bergen-Belsen became something you didn't talk about over coffee, not if you wanted to keep friends. Even among survivors, some buried the past so deeply that their own children didn't hear the stories until decades later. But Bergen-Belsen did not forget them, because places carry memory, because even when the buildings are gone, the soil remembers what it swallowed. And over time, that memory seeped upward, into books, into interviews, into museums, into the German school curriculum, into a new generation that no longer looked away. The Bergen-Belsen Memorial was established in 1952, then expanded in later years. It's not a place of spectacle, no wax statues, no dramatization, just names, photographs, testimonies, documents, and those stone markers that don't try to name the dead, because there are too many. Because the Nazis didn't leave records for everyone. Because you can't carve 6 million names into a wall and expect silence. You stand now at the edge of a field. It's silent here. The grass ripples in the wind. There are no fences, no dogs, no guards, only trees. And in that silence, you feel it, not guilt, but weight. The weight of history pressing into the present. The weight of what was done here, and the responsibility that comes with knowing it. You remember the trials. You remember the survivors. You remember the hangings not out of bloodlust, but because they mattered. Because without that final rope, without that verdict, something would have remained unclosed, not healed. That "sip's" not the right word, but recorded, acknowledged, buried, not beneath denial, but beneath names and memory, and the law. That's what justice looks like when atrocity is total. Not satisfaction, not triumph, but a ledger finely balanced, even if only for a moment, even if imperfectly, even if, in the end, no rope can ever match the crimes it punishes. But still, it matters, because without it, there would be only silence. And the world has already seen what evil can grow in silence. You step out of the courtroom. Not literally. That trial ended decades ago. The walls of Lüneburg are cold now, quiet. The gallows are dismantled. The paperwork is filed in yellowed folders in European archives. But in your mind, in history, the trial never truly ended. Because something still lingers. You can hear it in survivor voices, wavering but determined, when they speak of what it meant to testify, what it cost them to remember, to describe, to relive in public what they'd been trying for years to bury in private. Some wept. Some couldn't stop shaking. Some stared down their former tormentors and never blinked. And in that courtroom, for the first time, the silence cracked. The wall of denial splintered. For the British military court, it wasn't just about punishment. It was about documentation, about placing on public record, under cross-examination and evidentiary scrutiny, that what happened at Bergen-Belsen was not an abstraction, not hearsay, not myth, but fact. You listen to the testimonies: children forced to sleep on corpses, skeletal women clawing through latrines for food, guards laughing as prisoners collapsed mid-sentence. You hear about the roll calls that became death sentences, the beatings for stealing crumbs, the bodies left in piles so high that survivors walked on them to reach the water taps. And you realize this was not a death camp by design. Bergen-Belsen was not built to exterminate like Auschwitz. It became that. It decayed into that. Because of neglect. Because of cruelty. Because nobody cared to stop it. And that sits the horror of it. Evil didn't need a blueprint here. Only indifference. The British officers who entered Bergen-Belsen didn't come prepared for what they saw. Many had fought in North Africa, some in Italy, some in France. They'd seen death, they'd seen horror, but not this. Not heaps of nude, emaciated corpses sprawled in the mud. Not the stench of rot so thick it soaked through uniforms. Not living skeletons staring at them with hollow eyes too weak to even raise a hand. Soldiers vomited. Medics wept. Chaplain Leslie Hardman, the first Jewish cleric to enter, described it as the world SIP's darkest valley. They tried to help. They brought food, medicine, doctors, blankets, but many died anyway. Their bodies simply couldn't handle nutrition anymore. A crust of bread could kill a starving man. Refeeding syndrome. Few understood it then. The British burned the camp down. Not in rage, but necessity. Typhus was everywhere. The ground itself was infected. And as they torched the wooden barracks, the smoke rose like a second funeral. Then came the process of justice. 80 SS members were arrested immediately, including several female guards. The British knew what they were doing. They knew the world would be watching. They gathered records. They filmed everything. They ensured the trials would be unimpeachable, conducted with fairness, dignity, and transparency. No lynch mobs. No mob justice. This would be a court of law. And yet behind that formality, there was a fierce determination. Because these weren't distant crimes. They weren't abstractions read off paper. The prosecutors had walked through the piles. They had touched the dead. They wanted answers. Not everyone cooperated. Some guards pled not guilty. Others denied everything. I was just a clerk. I didn't know what was happening. I followed orders. But survivors had memories sharper than knives. They remembered the faces, the boots, the dogs, the lashes. They pointed. They named names. And in the end, the verdicts came down hard. 11 death sentences, 20 more to prison. And though some believed more should have hanged, there was still a sense that this time the system had worked, that the victims had been heard, that evil, for once, didn't get to slink away into anonymity. Still, not all sentences lasted. By the 1950s, some prisoners had been quietly released. West Germany, trying to move forward, began clemency procedures. Political pressure from allies wary of undermining the new German democracy played a role. The Cold War shifted the focus. Suddenly, the Soviets were the bigger threat. Nazis became yesterday's problem. But the survivors didn't forget. They kept the names. They wrote memoirs. They told their children quietly, sometimes brokenly, what they'd seen, what they'd lost. And over time, those children started asking questions, started digging through records, started visiting the campgrounds and wondering why the grass grew so thick over unmarked graves. They started to speak. By the 1970s and 80s, Holocaust awareness was rising. Television documentaries, school programs, visits to Bergen Belsen memorial sites. Irma Grace's photo, once a courtroom image, became a symbol of female cruelty. Books debated her psychology. Was she a sadist, a product of ideology? Both? But there were no easy answers. Only the record. Only the fact that she had power, and she used it to torture, humiliate, and kill. That was all the court needed to know. Still, the world asked, why so many women? Why so many willing to serve in places like Bergen-Belsen? Part of the answer lay in desperation. Nazi Germany by 1944 was collapsing. The draft had taken millions of men. Camps needed staff. And so women, often young, often working class, were recruited as auxiliaries. They were trained, indoctrinated, and given authority over life and death. Some reveled in it. Some simply adapted. And that adaptation, that terrifying ability of ordinary people to become functionaries of horror, remains the core lesson of Bergen-Belsen. Today, the memorial is stark. No reconstructed barracks, no simulations. Just a gray museum building, just stone markers with numbers. Here lie 5,000 dead. Here lie Anne's coma null children. Just that. No names. No eulogies. No personalization. Because there are too many. And because sometimes the void says more than words. Visitors walk quietly. School groups come from across Europe. Some light candles. Some leave pebbles on the memorial slabs. And the silence, the deliberate silence, is its own kind of reckoning. It invites you to imagine, to fill in the names, to ask the question every survivor still wrestles with: how did the world let this happen? You leave Bergen-Belsen changed, because now the rope isn't just history, it's a boundary. It separates who we were from who we refuse to become. It marks a line in time, the moment when a tribunal said that cruelty, even uniform, systematic cruelty, has limits, and that when those limits are crossed, there will be a reckoning. That's the legacy of those hangings. Not the death of 11 people, but the affirmation of a principle, that human dignity is not optional. That law must answer to conscience, and that memory, if preserved, becomes its own form of resistance.